The people of the ancient Mediterranean existed in a world of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. As you can see from this map, in an age before satellite imagery, Google Maps, and safe long-distance transport, ancient Mediterranean peoples didn't have a great understanding of the world's size or what lay beyond the lands that were easily accessible to them. But don't be fooled. Despite the difficulty, ancient Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and Phoenicians did, at times, travel extensively. As far back as the Bronze Age, the desire to trade resources connected people who lived far away from each other, and the Greco-Roman world would establish tenuous contacts as far off as China and India. But today, we're going to focus on the south, and take a look at people from the ancient Mediterranean who travelled deep into the mysterious continent of Africa. This was at a time when the Sahara Desert still presented a near impenetrable barrier, cutting the north of the continent off from the south. The power of camels would not be harnessed to the extent that trans-Saharan travel became widely possible until the 7th century CE. And although later trade with Europe and Asia would happen by ship as well as camel, the vessels of the ancient world were not sturdy enough to remain at sea for long periods of time. Therefore, travelling into sub-Saharan Africa for the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans presented a near impossible challenge. And yet, the human desire for discovery, acclaim, and wealth drove some to try. Today we're going to look at evidence for a few occasions in which people from this part of the world attempted to travel south into Africa in ancient times. Let's start where most ancient history starts, in Egypt. The ancient Egyptians inhabited the northeast corner of Africa, and their kingdoms spread through the modern nations of Egypt and Sudan. But the question we want to answer is, how far south did their knowledge spread? Well, all of that depends on what you think of the land of Punt. In the 15th century BCE, Egypt was ruled by Queen Hatshepsut, and before she died, she built herself a mortuary temple, the walls of which are lined with her achievements and the best things that happened during her reign. And one of her greatest legacies seems to have been an expedition that she launched to the land of Punt. She wasn't the first pharaoh to go there, and she wouldn't be the last, but her expedition is the best documented. On the walls of her temple, we can see the Egyptians arriving in this strange land by boat, and the depictions show all of the interesting flora and fauna that you could find in Punt. Like right there, that's a giraffe, and there's a turtle, and fish. So many different species of fish. The Egyptians also met and mingled with the local elites of Punt, including this woman here, called Queen Ati, who, well, she looks a little unusual, doesn't she? The unique physique of Queen Ati has been the subject of quite a bit of discussion. She may have had rickets, or perhaps she was just obese, or she may have had some other kind of condition. And there have been many attempts to retroactively diagnose her, but the only evidence we have for Queen Ati's existence is this picture here, and there's only so much speculation you can do from a stylized carving. Now, there certainly seems to be a great deal of curiosity on behalf of the Egyptians of what lay in the land of Punt. That's probably why they took the time to depict all of the interesting plants and animals. But the main reason that Hatshepsut went there seems to have been for resources and wealth. We see here the Egyptians uprooting live incense trees for transport back to Egypt, where they will be replanted. Hatshepsut clearly came here for these plants, these expensive and valuable plants, so that she could introduce them to her homeland and then not have to go back to Punt regularly to get more. Why did they not want to have to go back to Punt for more incense? Well, I think it's pretty obvious from the fact that Queen Hatshepsut is so proud of the success of this expedition that it was a risky and arduous affair going down to Punt. In fact, I think it's relatively safe to say that Punt represents the practical limits of Egyptian influence and civilization, as far as they were willing to go to exert themselves and their power. So, where exactly in Africa is Punt? Well, that's a good question, and I'm afraid that neither I nor anyone else has a definite answer for you. The Egyptians went there fairly regularly and were clearly fascinated with the place, but despite this, they never deigned to tell us where it is. We don't even know for sure that it's in Africa. Some people have suggested it might be the south of Arabia, modern-day Yemen, or even as far afield as Sri Lanka, which is ages away. But the most common guess is that Punt was somewhere around the Horn of Africa. The modern nations of Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia seem like a good region. And even though this is probably correct, we don't know that for sure. Was this truly the limit of Egyptian reach and knowledge? Did they ever go further than Punt for the sake of finding goods or for exploration? Even by accident, did they ever go deep into sub-Saharan Africa? Possibly, maybe, probably, but we don't know, because no accounts of such an expedition, if it ever took place, survive to us today. The next Egyptian expedition, which will try and go even further than Punt, doesn't happen for nearly 1,000 years later, and we hear that story through the mouth of a Greek. This is Herodotus, a well-travelled 5th century Greek who went out on a mission to find the peoples of the world and hear their stories. He went to the Black Sea, to Mesopotamia, and all the way to Egypt in order to do this, and then he compiled everything that he heard into a massive book, which he called the Inquiries, or the Histories, and hence he also got the title the Father of History. And it's while he's travelling in Egypt that he hears a story of a pharaoh who believed you could sail all the way around Africa, and set out to prove it. Necho II was a real go-getter pharaoh who had big plans for Egypt. The country is relatively strong under his 26th dynasty, but it's still a long way from the glory days of the New Kingdom and Ramses II and all of that. And Necho reckons he is the guy to launch Egypt back to greatness. Or at least he hopes to be. Necho has a little bit of a habit of failing to look before he leaps. He has a tendency to just dive into really ambitious projects without really thinking for too long about whether or not they're a good idea or if they will even work. He kicks off his reign by invading the Levant, hoping to reconquer the territories of the old Egyptian Empire. But the Babylonians get in his way and they foil his plans and he has to return to Egypt. His military campaign having failed, he turns to a building project. He plans to dig a canal that connects the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, kind of like the Suez Canal does nowadays. And he starts construction but then stops and the canal is never completed. Third time lucky, Necho has a new idea. Necho really likes ships. He wants to build a navy and become a maritime power. But there's something in his way. The Egyptians typically weren't great sailors. When they did sail, it was usually on the Nile River. And the Nile is great for sailing on, because the current goes north and the prevailing wind goes south. And that means that if you want to go up from Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt, from south to north, you just hop on your boat and the current takes you. And if you want to go the other way, unfurl your sails and the wind will take you. Piece of cake. The sheer ease of sailing on the Nile kind of spoils the Egyptians. Because, they can go up and down the Nile all day long, but as soon as they're confronted with the Great Green, which is what they called the open ocean, it became scary and terrifying to them, and they never really got any good at sailing it. But despite this, Necho plans on sending an expedition south to see if Africa can be circumnavigated. But he also knows that your average Egyptian sailor won't be up for this. He needs specialists. So he hires the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were a group of city-states that lined the Levant, modern-day Lebanon kind of area. And they were incredible seafarers. Navigation and mercantilism was in their blood. If you needed something done at sea in the first millennium BCE, the Phoenicians were the guys you turned to. And so Necho gets some Phoenicians and tasks them with going round Africa, starting in the Red Sea and going clockwise round the continent, returning to Egypt via the Pillars of Heracles, which is what the Greeks called the Rock of Gibraltar. And Herodotus tells us a little bit about how they did this. In an era before canning and tinning or reliable food preservatives, supplies were a real issue. So they took seeds with them, and every autumn they would beach their ships on whatever part of Africa they were at the time, plant the seeds, wait a little while for them to grow, harvest them, and then by doing so resupply themselves for the rest of the trip. I think it's also worth bearing in mind while we imagine what it might have been like sailing around Africa 2,500 years ago, that ships of this era were largely powered by oars. They had sails, but not very good ones. So these Phoenicians are essentially rowing around Africa. Although, to be fair to them, they do have the currents on their side for most of the journey. So, what did the Phoenicians encounter on this expedition? Well, doubtless loads. They must have seen an amazing array of things, from the landscapes unlike anything they'd ever seen before, unfamiliar wild animals that they might have encountered, maybe even an interaction with some indigenous people whose culture would have been indescribably alien to anything that they saw at home. But we don't hear about any of that, because our only source for this story, Herodotus, spends barely half a page relaying it to you. Look, that's the whole thing. That's the whole account that we have of this story. It's like 4 sentences. Herodotus tells us what they wanted to do, where they left from, how they fed themselves, and that it took them about 2 years to get to Gibraltar. And that's it. That's all he tells us about. He doesn't tell us anything about what the Phoenicians saw, what dangers they encountered, or what they discovered. The countless stories that these guys definitely brought back with them are lost to us. Probably forever. Almost certainly forever. Great. And part of the reason for this might have something to do with the fact that I don't think Herodotus really trusted the Phoenicians. I think he doubted quite a lot of the things that they said. For example, he tells us, "They made a claim, which I personally do not believe, although someone else might, that as they were sailing around Libya, they had the sun on their right." Ironically, the very thing that makes Herodotus doubt this story is the thing that lends it so much credibility. I mean, Herodotus himself never left the northern hemisphere. As far as he was concerned, the sun started in the east, in midday it was roundabout south, and then it set in the west. But we in the modern age, of course, know that the Phoenicians, whilst going down Africa, would have crossed the equator, and once in the southern hemisphere, the midday sun would have risen in the north. So as they travelled west, around what today would be the Cape of Good Hope, they would have seen the sun on their right-hand side, not on their left, as they were used to at home. Which leads many people, myself included, to conclude that the Phoenicians actually probably did circumnavigate Africa, or at least got pretty far. According to Herodotus, the Egyptians were not the only ones with an interest in going round Africa. In his own lifetime, another people, the Persians, would set off on their own expedition. The Persian Empire in the early 5th century was the largest empire that human history had ever seen up to that point. It was massive. But you know, they never really had any luck in Africa. They did manage to conquer Egypt, but they had a fairly hard time holding on to it because, well, the Egyptians never liked the Persians and they were a pretty rebellious people. The empire's second ruler, Cambyses, supposedly tried to invade both Libya and Ethiopia, with both attempts ending in disastrous failure. Cambyses' march to Ethiopia ended in a chaotic and cannibalistic retreat due to lack of supplies, and his army that went west into Libya, well, they just disappeared. No one knows what happened to them. But it was not conquest that motivated this next expedition south into Africa. It was scandal. A Persian nobleman by the name of Sataspes had forced himself on a Persian noblewoman, a great crime for which the king Xerxes sentenced him to death by impaling. However, Sataspes' mother, herself a relative of the king, intervenes on his behalf. She admits that her son is definitely guilty, but she convinces the king to renege on his sentence of death by impaling on the condition that she comes up with an even worse punishment for him. Sataspes' mother tasks him with sailing all the way around Africa, like the Phoenicians had done nearly 150 years previously. So Sataspes heads out to go all the way around Africa anti-clockwise, going through the Pillars of Heracles and then heading south, and south, and south, and further south for days and weeks on end, with no end in sight. Let's pause there for a second to talk about the estimation of the size of Africa in the minds of people in the ancient Mediterranean. Because even though people had probably already sailed all the way around it, no one seems to have conceived of its true size. Some of you might have seen this image before, often called the Herodotus map or the world according to Herodotus, and it shows roughly what his conception of geography was. Although it's worth noting Herodotus didn't make this. This is a modern creation based on his descriptions. Herodotus, as far as we know, never drew a map. But given that, it's fairly good. And as you can see, sub-Saharan Africa isn't really his specialty. He is a very, very, very well-travelled Greek, but his geography is still pretty off. I mean, of the 3 continents, Asia, Africa and Europe, he thinks Europe is the biggest one, which is Well off, not even close. And I think Herodotus's ignorance on the matter is a good sign that most Mediterranean people had no concept of the sheer size of the continent of Africa. And it's this that probably disheartens Sataspes. Apparently, after sailing south for some time, the sheer length and loneliness of his voyage gets to him, as he realises he's probably not going to see home again for a fairly long time. And so he turns around and goes back to Xerxes the way he came. And he gives some details about the things that he saw to the king, which is related to us by Herodotus.
In his report to Xerxes, he said that at the most southerly point they reached, they had been sailing past a country inhabited by small people, who wore clothes made out of palm leaves, and that whenever they had beached their ships, these people had abandoned their settlements and run away towards the hills, despite the fact that they had not approached them aggressively, and had only taken livestock from them.
When questioned about why he turned back and failed to fulfill his goal of going round the whole of the continent, Sataspes says something like, boat broke, got turned round, couldn't go further, stopped, terrible, didn't work, sorry. Xerxes does not buy this excuse and he impales Sataspes just as he had previously planned. And that's just kind of that. So, based on the account of Herodotus, we can assume that the Mediterranean peoples of the 5th century had a pretty tenuous grasp on what was happening south of the Sahara, despite the fact that a few of them had probably gone there before. So, what comes next? Well, that's the next story. Remember the Phoenicians, those people that Necho II got on side to try and circumnavigate Africa? Well, that's not all that they were up to in this time. They were still a seafaring and maritime people, and they got up to all sorts around the Mediterranean, including at one point founding an entirely new city called Carthage in modern-day Tunisia. In time, Carthage would become independent from its mother city of Tyre and found its own massive maritime empire in the Western Mediterranean, where it would be a centre of trade, wealth, and merchants. And it is the Carthaginians who will pick up the mantle of African exploration. This is Hanno the Navigator, a mysterious Carthaginian figure who probably lived in the 5th century BCE. Was he a king? Was he a nobleman? Was he a general? Was he an explorer or merchant? We don't know. We know very, very little about this man, and what we do know comes from snippets of later sources. His most famous story, and the one that I'm about to tell you, comes from a Greek translation of a Punic tablet that was supposedly installed in the temple of Baal-Hamon in Carthage, which then survives to us through a copy of a 10th century, probably 10th century, Byzantine manuscript. Which, just bear that in mind. That's the kind of sources that we're working with here.
The text tells us that Hanno crossed the Pillars of Heracles with 60 ships and 30,000 voyagers, with the intention of founding permanent settlements there. Going south, Hanno describes seeing large numbers of elephants, green fields and forests, and huge rivers. One of these rivers he judges to have been opposite Carthage, meaning it might lay on roughly this latitude. Hanno also described the mixed reception that he got from the local people. Some of them were welcoming to the Carthaginians and provided help as translators, whilst others threw rocks at them, and others simply fled in terror. Hanno and his expedition go back and forth quite a few times, clearly interested in setting up trade and supply posts along the way. But as he edges further south, he eventually reaches a great bay that his interpreters call the Horn of the West. Hanno described a large island, inside of which lies a lake, and inside of that, another island. When his men land, they initially see nothing but jungle, but then night falls, and in the trees numerous burning fires appear, along with the sound of pipes, drums, and cymbals. Then voices began joining in a great uproar, as the forest came alive with life and music. The Carthaginians began to get nervous, and they turned to their soothsayers for answers as to what to do next. The holy men tell them that they need to leave immediately, which they do in a panic, never to return. Continuing south, they see mountains on fire, fire that spills into the sea, and a great river filled with crocodiles and hippos, the whole lot, until eventually they find a new place to land. Here they found another island full of savage men. There were women too, in even greater number. They had hairy bodies, and the interpreters called them gorillae. When we pursued them, we were unable to take any of the men, for they all escaped by climbing the steep places and defending themselves with stones. But we took 3 of the women, who bit and scratched their leaders, and would not follow us. So we killed them, and flayed them, and brought their skins to Carthage. For we did not voyage further, provisions failing us.
Okay, so Hanno encounters a group of big hairy people, attempts to capture some of them, can't, and so he skins the ones he captures alive, which... lovely. And some of you might have already guessed that these gorillae sound a lot like gorillas. And that is because 19th century naturalists decided to name the ape after these big hairy people that Hanno supposedly encountered in his travels. Were they actually gorillas though? I think probably not. I mean, Hanno was a Carthaginian. Carthage is in Africa. He'd have been perfectly familiar with apes, monkeys, and those kinds of creatures, and would have probably been able to distinguish the difference between a human being and an ape. In fact, quite a lot of this story sounds pretty fantasy-esque. You know, Hanno talks about great mountains that reach all the way to the sun, that spew fire into the sea. And of course, we might hear that and go, oh, sounds like a volcano. And that could well be what they were. But, you know, Carthaginians were a Mediterranean people. There are volcanoes in the Mediterranean. They'd have probably been familiar with what an erupting volcano was. And what's all this about, like, an island with a lake in it that has another island in it that has another lake in it? Like, what the hell is that about? There's a lot about this story that we can question and doubt, including whether or not it really happened at all. And if it did, how far down Africa did Hanno actually get? Hanno, like most ancient people, Herodotus included, measures distance in days travelled, which is very practical for a merchant sailor, but not particularly good for actually identifying real distance. And his descriptions of the landscapes that he sees are just not specific enough to be identified with an actual place in Africa. You know, he talks about mountains, forests, sea, and he talks about animals like hippos, crocodiles, and elephants, all of which were things that the Carthaginians themselves would have been familiar with, and all of which are kind of pretty generic African stuff. You can find pretty much all of that anywhere along the west coast. As a result, estimates for the length of Hanno's expedition, if it happened at all, vary massively. Some people reckon he might have gotten as far as Gabon, whilst others don't think he got any further than the southern coast of Morocco. I'm perhaps being a little harsh on Hanno here, given that our only evidence for the account of this trip is a Greek translation of the original Punic tablet, which was probably copied a fair few times until it ended up being the version that we have today. For all we know, the description that we have translated from the Greek is pretty divorced from Hanno's original meaning. We just don't know, because any other evidence for Hanno's explorations was probably destroyed along with the city of Carthage in 146 BCE. He supposedly brought back the skins of the gorillae and hung them in the walls of the temple of Baal Hamon. But we can't tell that, even if the skins survive to this day, which they probably wouldn't, because the temple, along with the rest of the city, was utterly flattened. And it will be the people who flattened Carthage who will launch our next expedition. Welcome to the 1st century CE. The entirety of the Mediterranean is now under the control of the Roman Empire, and therefore under the control of the Roman Emperor, who at this time is a jolly, singy, dancey bloke called Nero. And Nero is very interested in what lies south of Egypt. Possibly because he intends to invade Ethiopia, maybe because he wants more reliable access to Indian Ocean trade routes, or maybe a more enlightened reason. Nero might have been searching for the source of the river Nile, and it's in that discussion that we get our main source of information. Seneca the Younger was a Stoic philosopher, intellectual, and politician who lived during Nero's reign. And in his Natural Questions, he argues with all of the self-righteous zeal of an ill-informed redditor that the source of the world's rivers comes from a giant subterranean sea.
I do not, indeed, suppose that you will long hesitate to believe that there are underground rivers and a hidden sea. From what other cause could rivers burst out and come to the surface unless the source of moisture were shut up within the earth? And don't you know that among the explanations given for the occurrence of the inundation of the Nile in summer, one is that it bursts forth from the ground, and is swollen not by rain from above, but by water given out from within the earth.
He then tells us the story of the search for the Nile source, which according to him was undertaken because the Emperor Nero was
devoted to virtue in every form, but especially solicitous for the interests of the truth.
It's funny because in a few years' time, Nero will brutally purge Seneca along with a number of other senators. Anyways, the Roman expedition starts going south, down the Nile, through the kingdoms of Ethiopia. Eventually, however, they encounter a giant marsh, miles of swampy mess filled with dying and overgrown vegetation that must have smelt horrific in the heat. And they ask the locals, how long does that go on for? And even they have no idea. It is entirely too shallow to take boats through, but it's also too deep to go through on foot. The only way to travel it apparently is in small one-person canoes, which the Romans aren't up for, so they end the expedition there and they go home. But not before they encounter, so they say, 2 giant rocks, out of which loads of water was gushing. So, does this prove Seneca's theory that the Nile comes from a great subterranean ocean? No. But, according to one historian, this might be a Roman description of Murchison Falls, which looks like this, and is in modern-day Uganda, meaning that the Romans got pretty close to Lake Victoria, which is where the Nile's actual water comes from. It would also make these first-century Italians the last Europeans to set eyes on this waterfall until the 19th century. If they saw it, which they probably didn't. If the description is correct, and Nero's expedition turned around when they came across a vast, impenetrable marsh, well then that probably means they never got further than the Sud, which is a giant, impenetrable marsh, coincidence I know, in modern-day South Sudan. And this wetland nightmare pretty perfectly matches the Roman description of it. It's full of overgrown vegetation and hippos and crocodiles and other nasty things. And frankly, if I was a Praetorian and I'd already gotten all the way through Sudan and Ethiopia only to find that, I would probably also reach my limit. And thus, the Romans failed to find the source of the Nile, leaving it to be discovered in 2013 by British television presenter and car enthusiast James May. And that's just sort of that. I've got no real conclusion here other than Africa is pretty big, I guess. Initially I wanted to do a video on the Herodotus map, you know, that I talked about earlier, and what the ancient Greek view of the world was beyond them, but I kind of got sidetracked. Ironically, not unlike Herodotus actually does quite a lot. And now we've got 5 barely connected stories of ancient Mediterranean people trying to go south into Africa, which, well, I know that I've missed some, and I probably haven't given you the complete picture. Please feel free to tell me all about that in the comments section. But mostly I wanted to do this video because it's just awesome, man. It's cool. Like, I love the history of, like, exploration, from the Polynesians navigating the Pacific Ocean using the stars, to the age of discovery, to what astronauts do nowadays. The human urge to see what's over the next horizon, over the next hill, across the next river, is just one of the most amazing things about our species. That and the idea of ancient people rowing around Africa in a wooden boat is just too cool, you know? And if you also think that that's really cool, feel free to subscribe. I'm thinking of doing another video on the ancient Romans and their connections with India and China, or something like that. Maybe Sri Lanka. A lot was going on with Sri Lanka at the time. But yeah, let me know. Until then, thank you all for watching.